This is a video for a stitching sample. First, I'm just going to make sure my machine is threaded correctly. Double check to make sure you're not crisscrossed in there. Otherwise, your machine will not sew correctly. You'll probably hear a noise that's concerning, and then you'll realize that your machine is not threaded correctly. Always thread from front to back. It's easiest if the light's on and you lower your presser foot. When you drop in that bobbin, remember this is only your first step, putting it in the slits. You then have to hold your left hand, move the hand wheel towards you till the needle goes down and up one time, and then if you have your shears, you can sweep your shears underneath, and then you should have your bobbin thread come up through that little oval directly under the presser foot. Be sure to have about a foot of thread here hanging out, and then you will be ready to sew. You should have received a small piece of cloth, white cloth from me. I'm going to get my sewing shears, and today we are going to sew 3 different stitches. So you are going to sew them all on this. You can write your name directly on this fabric and turn it into me for a grade. So the first thing says you have to sew a straight stitch, presser foot even, back stitch beginning and end. So presser foot even means I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric with the right side of my presser foot. I'm going to start at the very top edge of my fabric. I'm going to lower my presser foot. I'm going to sew about 3 or 4 stitches forward, slowly and in control. And then I'm going to press my reverse button down, and I'm going to hold that button down the whole time that I want to sew backwards. As soon as I let it go, I'm going to start sewing forwards again. As I sew, because this is presser foot even, I want to make sure my right edge lines up with the edge of my fabric the entire way down that side. So I'm going to sew slow and in control. When I get close to the end, I really want to go slow. I might even just use my hand wheel to get to the end. And then I also want to backstitch again. Backstitching secures my stitch so my stitch won't unravel. So I'm going to press the reverse button again, hold it the entire time I want to go backwards, go back about 3 or 4 stitches, let go, and then sew to the end. Again, use your hand wheel if you want more control. Make sure your take-up lever is in the highest position. Lift up your presser foot, pull out your fabric. You're going to have several inches of thread. Make sure you cut next to the fabric. Okay, don't cut the fabric, just cut next to the fabric. And then on the end where you started, you also want to trim these threads. So go ahead and cut nice and close to the fabric. And you can see my top thread and my bottom or bobbin thread. Again, I have nice long thread here ready for me to sew the next thing. Next, I'm going to change to a zigzag stitch. So I need to look at my stitch selector, change the dial to the zigzag. It says that I'm supposed to sew it at 5/8 of an inch on one edge. No back stitching this time. So if you look down by your presser foot, you will see your seam allowance lines, and one of them says 5/8. So I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric with that 5/8 line. I'm going to start at the very top edge of my fabric. I'm going to sew, and I'll notice that my stitch is now zigzag. It's going back and forth. So you are going to sew all the way down, keeping the edge of your fabric lined up with the 5/8 seam allowance line. And when you get close to the end, you are again going to use your hand wheel. Make sure your take-up lever is in the highest position. Pull out your fabric, trim up your threads at the start, where you started and where you finished. And now I have my zigzag stitch at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Last thing that we're going to do is a basting stitch. Turn your stitch aisle back to straight stitch. We want to set our stitch length at 4 because that is a long, wide, temporary stitch called a basting stitch. I'm going to again sew at, this time it's 1/4 of an inch. So again, this is presser foot even. So I'm going to line it up presser foot even again. It says no back stitch. I'm going to sew slow and control. Oh, that got a little fast. I need to slow down. And when I get to the end, I'm just going to use my hand wheel so I have more control. Make sure your take-up lever is in the highest position. pull out your thread, trim it right at the end and where you started. And you can see that I have a wider stitch there than down here, or than over here. This is much wider because it is at 4 stitch length instead of 2.5. This one was 2.5. This one is a basting stitch of 4. So I'm going to label this right on the fabric as basting stitch at presser foot even. I'm going to label this as zigzag stitch at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And I'm going to label this as straight stitch with back stitch beginning and end at presser foot even.